My name is Diane Coleman. I'm 52 years old, and for 23 years, I raised my daughter Emma by myself in a two-bedroom rental in Dayton, Ohio. Her father left when she was 2. He sent a birthday card twice, then nothing. I worked the day shift at a diner off Route 4 and the night shift cleaning offices downtown. I slept in the gaps. I never told Emma how bad it got. She never knew that some winters I skipped meals so she could have a coat that fit. She never knew I sold my mother's wedding ring the year she needed braces. She just knew that dinner was always on the table, that I never missed a school play, and that no matter how tired I looked, I always had time to help with homework. She grew into a kind, sharp, hard-working young woman. She got a scholarship to Ohio State, majored in accounting, and landed a good job at a firm in Columbus. That's where she met Daniel. Daniel Whitfield came from money. Old Columbus money. His father, Richard Whitfield, owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states and sat on the board of a country club I couldn't have afforded to walk past. Daniel himself was sweet, a little awkward, clearly smitten with Emma from the day they met. I liked him. I didn't much like his father. I'd met Richard Whitfield exactly twice before the wedding. The first time, at an engagement dinner, he'd looked at my discount rag blazer and asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, what line of work I was in. When I told him I managed a diner, he said, "How resourceful," and turned to talk to someone else. The second time, at a cake tasting, he spent 20 minutes describing his lake house in a way that made it very clear I would never see the inside of it. I told myself it didn't matter. Emma loved Daniel. Daniel loved Emma. That was the whole point. The wedding was held at a vineyard estate outside Columbus, the kind of place with a name like Willow Crest and a strict dress code printed on the invitation. Emma insisted on paying for half of it herself, and I insisted on covering what I could, which wasn't much. Richard Whitfield paid for the rest and made sure everyone knew it. I wore the best dress I owned, navy blue, tailored, bought 2 years earlier for a cousin's funeral. I'd had my hair done that morning at the cheapest salon in town that still knew how to do an updo. I felt good. I felt proud. My daughter, my girl who I raised on diner tips and overnight shifts, was marrying a man who adored her. The ceremony was beautiful. Emma cried. I cried. Even Daniel's mother, Patricia, who'd always been polite to me in a distant sort of way, dabbed her eyes. It was at the reception, during the toasts, that everything changed. Richard Whitfield stood up, champagne glass in hand, and gave a toast that started warm enough stories about Daniel as a boy, a joke about golf, a line about how proud he was. Then he turned toward our side of the room, toward me, and smiled that same smile from the engagement dinner. And to the Coleman side of the family, he said, raising his glass a little higher, I have to say, we've come a long way to be standing here today. Diane worked so hard to give Emma opportunities she herself never had. It's really quite something. Watching someone claw their way up from, he paused, chuckled, well, from where they started. I know it must be a little overwhelming for her, being here among all this. But we're happy to have her, truly. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes something cruel just happened out loud. A few of Richard's country club friends laughed, that soft, knowing laugh rich people give each other when they think they're being subtle. Patricia's face went tight. Daniel looked mortified. Emma's hand found mine under the table and gripped it hard. I felt my face go hot. 23 years of double shifts, of missed meals, of holding myself together so my daughter never had to worry. And this man had just stood in front of 200 people and called me an embarrassment with a smile on his face. I could have stood up and made a scene. God knows I wanted to. But I'd learned a long time ago that the people who humiliate you in public are usually hoping you'll make a scene, because it lets them play the victim afterward. So I smiled, squeezed Emma's hand back, and said quietly, let them have their toast, baby. We'll have ours. I didn't know yet exactly what I meant by that, but something in me had decided, right there at that table, that Richard Whitfield was going to learn who I actually was. Here's what Richard Whitfield didn't know about me, because he'd never once asked a real question into years of knowing me. He didn't know that 15 years earlier, one of the office buildings I cleaned at night belonged to a small investment firm called Bristol Hale Partners. He didn't know that the overnight security guard there, A kind man named Walter used to let me sit in the break room during my rounds and read the financial newspapers, the analysts left behind, because I found the world in them fascinating, a world I'd never get to touch. Or so I thought. He didn't know that one of those analysts, a young man named Curtis Bryant, used to stay late working on his own portfolio and, out of boredom or kindness, started explaining what he was doing to the tired cleaning lady who kept asking smart questions. He didn't know that Curtis eventually helped me open a small brokerage account with $300 I'd managed to save, and that I kept adding to it, $5 and $10 at a time, for years, because it was the one thing in my life that felt like it might someday multiply, instead of just disappear. He didn't know that Curtis Bryant went on to found his own investment fund, and that I was one of his first clients, and that he never forgot the woman who used to ask him questions at midnight while emptying trash cans. None of it came easy, and none of it came fast. In 2008, when the market cratered, I watched almost half of what I'd saved evaporate in a matter of months. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a statement in front of me, doing the math on whether I'd have to pull Emma out of her college savings plan just to keep the lights on. I didn't sleep for a week. Curtis told me to hold. That panic selling was how people turned a paper loss into a real one. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, trusting a 26-year-old's advice with money I'd bled tips and overnight shifts to save. I held. It took almost 4 years to recover what I'd lost. The diner very nearly broke me too. I bought my first location 6 years after that crash, using savings and a loan I paid off early. And 18 months in, my head cook quit without notice. The same month the walk-in freezer died. I ran the grill myself for 3 weeks straight, still cleaning offices at night to cover the repair bill, because I couldn't afford to close even for a day. I lost 2 suppliers that year who decided a woman running her first restaurant alone was too much of a risk to extend credit to. I found new ones who didn't think that way, and I never forgot which was which. It took nearly a decade of scraping, one bad year rolling into a slightly better one, before I could afford the second location, and longer still for the third. And he certainly didn't know about the supplier deal, or how close it had come to ruining me instead of building me up. 2 years before the wedding, Coleman Family Diners LLC had acquired a majority stake in a struggling regional supplier, a company that serviced, among other things, the parts and maintenance contracts for several car dealership chains in Ohio, including, as it happened, Whitfield Auto Group. The first year was brutal. The previous owners had quietly hidden inventory losses I didn't discover until after closing, and 3 months in, our largest logistics contract fell through without warning. My accountant told me flatly I might lose the whole investment, diners included, if I couldn't turn it around within 2 quarters. I refinanced the diners to keep the supplier afloat and ran both businesses at once for the better part of a year, rebuilding client relationships one phone call at a time, the same way I'd built everything else, slowly, and by actually showing up. By the time of the wedding, 8 months after I'd finally stabilized it, the company was profitable again. But I'd come within a season of losing everything I'd spent a lifetime building. I hadn't planned any of this as revenge. It was just business, built slowly, over years, by a woman nobody thought to look at twice. But sitting at that reception, humiliated in front of 200 people, I realized I had something better than a scene. I had leverage, and I had patience, the one skill 23 years of hard living teaches you better than anything else. I didn't do anything that night. I danced with my daughter. I hugged Daniel and told him to take care of her. I hugged Patricia, who quietly apologized for her husband's toast, which told me she wasn't like him. I even shook Richard's hand at the end of the night and thanked him for hosting such a lovely event, because I wanted him comfortable. Comfortable people don't see what's coming. 3 weeks later, I asked Curtis for a favor, the first personal one I'd ever asked him. I wanted a full picture of Whitfield Auto Group's financial position, as much as could be gathered from public filings and industry contacts. It didn't take him long to find what I suspected. Richard's dealership empire looked shinier than it was. He'd expended too fast in the last 5 years, taken on heavy debt, and was leaning hard on a handful of key supplier and service contracts. to keep his newer locations afloat. One of those contracts ran through the regional supplier my company now controlled. I want to be clear about something. I never threatened Richard Whitfield. I never called him. Never sent an angry letter. Never told Emma or Daniel what I was doing. This wasn't about hurting my daughter's marriage or embarrassing her new family the way he'd tried to embarrass me. This was quieter than that. When the supplier contract came up for renewal that spring, our company reviewed it like we reviewed every contract on the merits. Whitfield Auto Group's payment history had been inconsistent for over a year. A fact Richard had been hiding from his own board by shuffling numbers between entities. Our finance team recommended renegotiating the terms significantly in our favor. Given the risk, that's just good business. I signed off on it. Around the same time, at a Rotary Club fundraiser I attended as a small local business owner, I happened to sit at a table with two other people, a loan officer from a regional bank and a reporter for the Columbus Business Journal who covered the auto industry. I didn't orchestrate the seating. I did when the reporter mentioned she was working on a piece about over-leveraged dealership groups in the Midwest, mentioned that our supply company had noticed some concerning payment patterns from a few clients, without naming names, because that would have been unprofessional. And I am, whatever else I am, a professional. I want to be honest with you. I didn't need to say much. Richard Whitfield had built a house of cards, and it turned out a lot of people in that industry had been quietly worried about him for a while. All it took was one tightened contract and one honest conversation to start the cards falling on their own schedule. By early summer, Whitfield Auto Group was in real trouble. 2 dealerships closed. Richard had to bring in outside investors to keep the rest afloat, and it meant giving up a controlling stake in the company he'd spent 30 years building. The Business Journal ran a piece about overextension in Ohio's dealership sector that mentioned Whitfield by name, among others, and quoted a supplier who requested anonymity about tightening credit standards industry-wide. That anonymous supplier's quote had, in fact, come from my head of finance, relaying language I'd approved. I never lied. I never manufactured a problem that wasn't real. I simply stopped extending Richard Whitfield the invisible grace that people like him receive their whole lives without ever noticing it, the grace of being given the benefit of the doubt, of being trusted on a handshake, of having their shaky finances quietly covered for by people who assumed a man in his position must know what he was doing. I stopped covering for him. That was the whole revenge. Withdrawing a kindness he never knew he was receiving, and never once offered to me. Daniel and Emma were, of course, affected by the family stress, though not financially. Daniel had his own career and had never taken a dime from his father's business. Emma told me, a little shaken, that Richard's company was struggling and that Patricia was worried. I listened. I comforted her, and I never once mentioned my involvement. That part of my life stayed separate from hers, exactly as it always had. The moment I'd been waiting for, without fully admitting to myself that I was waiting for it, came about a year after the wedding, at Emma and Daniel's first anniversary dinner. It was a smaller gathering, family only, at a nice restaurant Daniel had picked. Richard Whitfield showed up looking older than his 60 years, thinner, quieter. The swagger from the wedding toast was gone. At some point in the evening, when the conversation turned casually to work, Patricia mentioned, with obvious relief, that things had finally stabilized, that a new investor group had come in and things were manageable again. Richard nodded and said, almost to himself, that he'd learned a hard lesson about not knowing who your real partners were. He looked at me then. I don't know if some instinct told him something, or if it was just a father-in-law making conversation, but he asked, politely this time, genuinely this time, what exactly my diner business had grown into over the years. I told him the truth, plainly, without drama. 3 diner locations, a majority stake in a regional food and auto parts supply company, a modest but well-managed investment portfolio I'd built since my 30s. I watched the math happen behind his eyes, watched him connect Coleman Family Diners to the supplier that served his dealerships, watched him realize, slowly and without me having to say another word, whose tightened contract terms had been one of the dominoes. He didn't say anything ugly. To his credit, he didn't make excuses either. He just went quiet, And then he said, "I owe you an apology, Diane, for the toast. It was cruel. And it was stupid, and I've thought about it more than you'd probably believe." I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. I wasn't interested in grinding him into the floor in front of my daughter. That was never the point. The point had been made a long time before that dinner. In every decision I'd made about how to run my company with integrity, while a man who once called me an embarrassment learned, slowly and privately, exactly what real resourcefulness looks like. Emma found out the whole story much later, from Patricia of all people, who'd pieced it together, and rather than being angry, told Emma she thought it was the most quietly dignified thing she'd ever witnessed. Emma called me crying, not from sadness, but from something like awe. She asked why I never told her. I told her the truth. I didn't build any of it for revenge. I built it because a night security guard once let a tired cleaning woman read the newspaper, and a young analyst once thought her questions were worth answering. And because I refused, every single day for 23 years, to let anyone convince me that where I started was where I had to stay. Richard Whitfield's comeuppance wasn't something I engineered out of spite. It was just what happens when you finally stop being underestimated by people who built their whole lives on being underestimated correctly. At Emma's second wedding anniversary, Richard raised another toast. This one was shorter, and it was for me. He called me, in front of the same country club friends who'd laughed the first time, the most formidable businesswoman I have ever had the privilege of underestimating. I raised my glass back to him. 23 years of double shifts had taught me a lot of things, but maybe the most important one was this: you don't need to humiliate the people who humiliate you. You just need to keep building, quietly, patiently, until the truth of who you are becomes impossible for anyone to ignore.